Hi everyone, my name is Marianne Osmond. I am the Director of Programs and Learning with Catalyst. Really excited to have you all join us for our post-election briefing. We have a really great conversation ahead of us and really excited to have you all here. A couple of reminders as you entered the Zoom. Many of you have probably noticed that your mic automatically mutes. In order to be mindful of the conversation, we do ask that you keep your mic muted. There will be a Q&A portion later in the program, so we want to make sure that up until that point that folks can hear the conversation. And then, of course, if you have questions later on, as we're doing that, then you feel free to unmute if there's a question you do end up asking. Separately, I encourage you all to please introduce yourself in the chat. We won't have time to do icebreakers or anything like that. We have a jam-packed agenda, so we're going to go right into it. So please go ahead and if you feel comfortable, we encourage you to introduce yourself with your name, your organization, any other details about you, such as your pronouns. We have a really great crowd today of just folks across various different, not only funders, but sectors and including nonprofits. So we just want to make sure that folks have the chance to introduce themselves in this space. I am excited to introduce our CEO, Megan Thomas. Before I do want to just give a brief overview of what today's conversation will be like. So after Megan does her welcoming remarks, we will have Rhiannon, who is our public policy consultant, really launch into the landscape that we are in today from both the federal level all the way down to the local level. After that, we're going to have a really great conversation with our two other speakers who are joining us, Luis Montero-Adams, the Director of Engage San Diego, and Margarita Luna, the Interim Managing Director of the California Endowment. So they will both be speaking to from both the funder and the community perspective about what comes next. And I really encourage you all to think of your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. I will be making sure to capture those so that Rhiannon has them in that conversation. But feel free to also, again, if you have questions later on, feel free to hold off until then and go ahead and raise your hand. So without further ado, I will now pass it over to Megan.
Thank you, Marianne. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. As Marianne said, my name is Megan Thomas. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am your president and CEO here at Catalyst. And I'm just really pleased to see this crowd. We've got 31 people on the Zoom now, had another dozen who RSVP'd who might join us. But it just shows to me the importance of this topic, and that as a community we're coming to realize that regardless of how you enter into a community and what different roles, different hats you might wear, we're recognizing that political leaders and the policies that shape the systems we operate in are really important. I also recognize that we're all bringing different experiences into this conversation, depending on who you are, where your family's from, the work that you do, the passions that you carry, the communities that you're a part of. The results of the election can mean a lot of different things for you. And that's okay. It's that diversity, that plurality, that wealth of experience that makes such a unique and vibrant community. And we have so many different angles at which we can approach solving some of the challenges that we face. We're really fortunate to have Rhiannon and Luis and Margarita here to talk with us from some of those different perspectives, bringing us what I think of as sort of everything from just the facts man to a sort of impassioned plea for how we need to respond to the moment. So we have a couple of objectives today. One is we really want to pause and acknowledge that each person here today and every person we encounter in our work and daily lives is human and deserving of compassion and a whole life. And that while our work is important, how we care for ourselves and one another is what lets us do that work. So that's also very important. And knowledge, in my experience, is one form of self-care and empowerment. And that's the second objective of today, and probably the one that you came here for, is to share with you some information that can help support your decisions now and into the future. And finally, we come back to our values. Regardless of who's in the White House, who chairs the county board of supervisors, or who is on your school board, collectively, the folks who show up in rooms that Catalyst hosts are here to support the communities around them. So we all share that objective and are sort of showing up in the world in that way. So foundations and 501(c)(3) nonprofits work is partisan, or excuse me, is nonpartisan specifically. Let that be known in the recording. Um, but that does not mean that we are agnostic to policy, right? Policy is a critically important topic for us to be paying attention to, or at least to be spending time with people and learning from people who are paying attention. We operate in an environment that is deeply impacted by politics and policy. We can think about uh, the topic of public-private partnership. We love to think about how can philanthropy show up in a space and help leverage larger regional, state, or federal dollars that make up the bulk of the money that's running around in our communities. We can think about the pressures that are faced by communities we seek to support. It matters what the policies are for who can be educated or what happens when you show up for food support or what medical care access looks like. The policies and the people who are implementing those policies matters because the sort of second piece of policy is after it's set, right? We can have written words on a document that say all the most wonderful things, but who is implementing them and how that looks out in communities is a really important factor of how it affects the people that philanthropy supports. Um, it's important too to recognize that the way elected and appointed officials build relationships with people in other sectors has an impact on how they see their jobs. So we won't get too much into it today, but part of the work that Catalyst does is making sure that we know the folks who are making the decisions and can be part of an environment in which they are accountable to and informed by the communities that they serve. So the kind of closing things that I wanted to say were, we do everything with a priority at Catalyst on equity, collaboration, and finding ways for communities to hold power through having an influence over the resources that support them that philanthropy holds and puts together processes and makes decisions about. And so we think similarly about policy. We want to have you leave here today having considered ways that you can not just write the checks that fund the day-to-day work of community organizations, but also think about how those communities are able to be civically engaged throughout the year, how there can be some sort of watchdog function to make sure that the legal and human rights that we all have remain accessible to folks, and how to think through folks who've been left out or intentionally shut out of prosperity and safety can hold on to or regain that right. And as we see sort of regressive policies and the early warning signs about the ways that communities might be impacted, from immigration to LGBT communities to healthcare, we know that that sort of protection and recovery of rights is going to become more and more important in the days to come. So I'm going to turn this over to Rhiannon in a moment to talk about sort of what happened in the election, some of the ways that funders, foundations can think about it. And then we're going to hear from the sort of direct experience of Margarita and Luis. And the last thing I would say is just the notion of coming together is really important. So having you all here today with us in a community of folks who thought it was worth an hour of their time to show up and learn about the policy and political environment around our work shows us that we have what we need to be successful. We have what we need to build a community that is looking after its folks on a day-to-day basis and at a systems level. And so we want to, maintain this community, maintain this connection, and stay in communication and in alignment as we move forward to advance the goals that we all have. So that'll hand it over to Rhiannon, who, if you don't know, has been working with us, supporting leading policy work at Catalyst for the last at least 5 years, if not perhaps more than that. Prior to that, she played leadership roles for policy in numerous nonprofits in the region, and is just a real asset to all of us here at Catalyst and for all of you who are part of our community. So thank you, Rhiannon. Please take us into the session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank all of you for being here today. I want to reiterate, that this is just the beginning of this conversation and the beginning of the work ahead, and there will be plenty more conversations and a lot more work ahead. And before we get to our amazing panel today, I'm just going to give you an overview of what happened in this last election from a local, state, and federal level, and what that can tell us a little about what's happening in the electorate and what those implications are for making policy over the next few years. Then we'll jump into our panel to speak a little more to specific policy implications. So what I'm really going to focus on in my little 15-20 minutes is some of what has and has not changed, and how what has changed may affect the policy landscape, and a little bit about what ballot measures from across the country can tell us about the electorate. So jumping right in, we'll start with the easy stuff, which is what hasn't changed. First and foremost, when we're just a few weeks out from election, same thing every time, votes are still being counted. So we don't have exact numbers for anything yet. And even when we do have those numbers, it will be months before the voter file is completely updated. And all of our data gurus, like Luis, of the world will be able to analyze voter turnout and demographics and give us a really clear picture of this entire election. So anything you're hearing about group X didn't vote and group Y did, and that's why this happened, it's mostly speculation and based on initial observations and exit polls. Maybe we can get back together in the spring and take a look at some of that data once it's in, because that would be fun. And I would also encourage you all to join us on March 25th for our 100-day briefing, when we know a little bit more about what is actually happening. And there you can all either tell me that I was right about everything, totally wrong, or a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I am going to give you the same caveat that Megan gave you, which is that this is a nonpartisan briefing. That being said, you will hear me saying the words Democrat and Republican, so don't freak out. It's not from a partisan standpoint of making any commentary on preferences for or judgments about any party or candidate, but from an analytic standpoint of what has and has not changed and how that affects the creation of policy. So if I were to say Region X voted for the Y party candidate for the last 20 years and voted for this party this year, that's a nonpartisan fact that something has changed. So don't freak out at the words Democrat and Republican, it's still nonpartisan. So getting right into what hasn't changed. Imperial County. So Imperial County, as they have done in many, many elections, voted for the Democratic candidate again for president. No change in that, except that it was the absolute closest that it's been. Usually Imperial County has voted for the Democratic candidate in the presidential elections somewhere in the 60 percentile range. And this year, neither candidate received over 50% of the votes in Imperial County. So it was very close. They also, as they usually swing, they voted for Democrats for Senate, Congress, and Assembly, but again, from a much smaller margin than before, so it's getting closer. San Diego County, same story. Voted for the Democratic candidate for president, as they usually do, but by a smaller margin. And as expected, the districts in San Diego County that usually vote for Democrats, well, guess what? They voted for Democrats. The ones that normally voted for Republicans, yeah, they voted for Republicans for Senate, House, Assembly, State Senate. No real big surprises. Also, not a huge amount of surprises when it comes to local elections for County Board of Supervisors or City Council. By and large, when it comes to those offices, our regions voted the way they normally do. Again, in many cases, just by smaller margins. So things are getting closer. California, in general, same story. Did pretty much exactly what you might expect it to do. It swung for the Democratic candidates for presidential and Senate candidates, and in keeping with everywhere else, by smaller margins. The California legislature, it had a Democratic supermajority before the election, and it's going to have a Democratic supermajority again after this election. Not much has changed when it comes to that. So, what has changed? Well, let's start with the most obvious. I don't know if you know or not, but the nation's executive branch changed hands in what was objectively one of the most unusual presidential campaign seasons ever. And President-elect Trump, he fared better in both the electoral and popular vote than he did when he won the first time in 2016. He got back Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona, all of which he won in 2016 but lost in 2020. And he won Nevada, which he lost in both 2020 and 2016. In fact, Nevada has not voted for a Republican presidential candidate since 2004. So that was a pretty big change. We have to go back even farther to the late 1800s, to Grover Cleveland, to see a president who was defeated for a second term and then came back 4 years later and won. That doesn't happen very often. Now, not very many have tried, but the ones who have tried, they didn't win. And then President Biden dropping out of the race, that's the first time that has happened since the modern primary system started. So regardless of the outcome, it was a very, very strange election season that was very confusing to watch and listen to. Other things that we saw that were very strange and unusual that seemed to be a trend across the country is incredibly high split ticket numbers. So those are states that voted Republican for the presidential candidate, but then voted for Democrats for governors or senators. So these are people who split their votes between parties. And in just about all of the battleground states, when Republicans won their Senate seat, they underperformed compared to the presidential race. Usually what you see is more of a similar percentage between the president numbers and the governor Senate numbers. So if the Republican presidential candidate gets 60% of the vote, you usually see that the Senate Republican candidate also gets 60% of the vote, give or take a percentage point here and there. What we're seeing more of in this election is that the Republican presidential candidate, if he was to get 60% of the vote, if the Republican Senate candidate wins, they're getting a noticeably smaller percentage than the candidate for president, suggesting that people voted for a Republican presidential candidate, and again, but for a Democrat or another party for senator or governor. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to the ballot measures, but suffice it to say, we hear a lot about this being a politically divided country, but we're not just a politically divided country, our individual voters are politically divided in themselves as well. Along with the executive branch changing hands, the Senate changed hands. The House of Representatives went into the election with 221 Republicans and 214 Democrats. There are still a few seats that are not completely counted yet and could potentially change, but it does look like Republicans will keep the House. Republicans in the Senate gained 4 seats, which brings them to a majority of 53. So this leads to an exciting outcome that we like to call the trifecta. So one party holds the executive branch and both houses of Congress. And I've heard a lot of buzz and a lot of concern about this trifecta. So I'd like us all to keep in mind that trifectas actually happen very frequently, and they typically last 2 years. While we vote on a president every 4 years, every House seat is up for election every 2 years, and a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. And what usually happens with this type of a trifecta is that the ruling party tries to push as much policy through as fast as humanly possible and tackle their biggest and most pressing policy initiatives right away. It's how President Obama got the Affordable Care Act. It's how President Trump got the tax cuts. It's how Biden got the infrastructure bill. What we've also seen in the past is that Americans actually like this whole checks and balances thing, and they like a little compromise. So they may express their extreme displeasure about the state of the country by giving absolute power to one party in a presidential election. But what we see over and over again is that after 2 years of one party, whichever one it is, jamming through all of this major policy change without having to really work with the other party at all, the country tends to get up off their couches in the midterm election and give the House or Senate back to the opposing party so that there is no overwhelming ruling party anymore. Will we see that again? I can't say for sure, but that's what we've seen in the past. So being that we do have a trifecta right now for at least 2 years, what are we likely to see in Congress? Well, what we've seen in trifectas before, to start with, a very fast, very furious 2 years of massive policy initiatives and executive orders. Both Congress and the president-elect know how this works. They know they may only have 2 years, so they're going to do as much as they can with it. And what might that be? Well, at its very heart, what we do know about the results of the election was that most people voted based on the economy. We see this all the time. People going to the polls felt that their pocketbooks were better off 4 years ago than they are today. And those people overwhelmingly voted for President-elect Trump. Again, this is not new news. Whatever party is in power, if people feel like they were better off 4 years ago, they vote to change the leadership. What we do know is a lot about what President-elect Trump has said about his policy priorities. And number one on that list, immigration and border security, climate, tariffs. The next 2 years will probably be overwhelmed with a major tax bill and a lot of border-related executive orders and legislation starting day one. We'll also likely see a reversal of a lot of climate legislation and regulations, and we're probably going to really start to see it day one with just a slew of executive orders. Other priorities include trying to eliminate DEI initiatives, deregulation, and education reform. The other thing that we do know is that he's starting much sooner than he did in his last term. In 2016, he didn't start naming cabinet appointees until December, and he has already named just about everyone. And what we also know is that whether you like or dislike President-elect Trump, one thing has always been very clear to his most adoring fans and his most virulent dislikers: he is chaotic, and he does pretty much whatever he wants, regardless of whether the people advising him think it's a good idea. So whatever else we can expect from that presidency, we can expect that, the unexpected. And that's what we've seen from his picks for cabinet so far. They all have one thing in common. They have absolute unwavering loyalty to him. And many of them are also extremely controversial, whether it's their experience, their views, or conflicts of interest. There's a lot of talk about these being very interesting and controversial picks. President-elect has also demanded that the Senate agree to using recess appointments for his cabinet, which could bypass the confirmation process. So what does this mean for all of our grantees and philanthropy? Many of the hot button issues are the ones that our grantees live in day to day, all the time. And the only answer to this kind of chaos is flexibility and the ability to pivot. And over the next 2 years, with legislation and executive orders probably just coming at us in a never-ending wave, we all have to be ready to pivot, multitask, and engage in rapid response. And that's something that can be started today. So I think one big takeaway from today is if you don't have rapid response guidelines and procedures in place, now, before January, is a great time to get all of that set in stone. So talking a little bit about those hot button issues, we get to see a lot of that in ballot measures across the country. And what has happened with ballot measures has been very interesting, especially for a ballot measure nerd like me. Often one side has seen that putting a measure on the ballot that addresses a hot button issue can bring out voters who are more partial to one candidate or the other. For instance, a state that passes an anti-trans ballot measure may also elect an anti-trans governor, and so on. What we've seen across the country this year, in many cases, is more split ticket voting. Voters are voting to protect abortion rights, but then voting for anti-abortion candidates. They're voting to raise the minimum wage, and then they're voting for candidates that don't support raising the minimum wage. Voters approved minimum wage increases to $15 an hour in Alaska and Missouri, which typically not the type of candidates that they vote for. They expanded workers' ability to earn paid sick leave in Alaska, Missouri, and Nebraska. Also, not the states you would expect to do that. Constitutional right to abortion in Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, Nevada, and New York. Some of those sound like, yeah, that sounds about right. Some of them, no, they went the other way when it went for candidates. What does that mean? Well, it means people are complicated, and they have complicated and contrasting views on things. What we're seeing with ballot measures is that ballot measures are actually, in a way, giving people permission to vote for a candidate that disagrees with them. In other words, rather than saying, I agree with candidate X about just about everything, but I can't vote for them because they support abortion, they're saying, I actually feel okay voting for this candidate that I completely disagree with on abortion because I can vote on the issue of abortion, and that makes me feel like I'm not betraying my values. And in California, we've seen a little bit of the same trend. We've had some surprising ballot measure votes. We voted no on eliminating forced labor for inmates. We voted no on raising the minimum wage. And then we voted yes to overturning parts of Prop 47 and increasing sentencing for certain drug and theft crimes. Yet we voted overwhelmingly for candidates that hold completely opposing views on all those positions. The biggest change policy-wise from the ballot measures will be Prop 36. That will go into effect, I believe, in December. And it's going to be a while before we see what kind of impacts the measure has. But we're going to be hearing a lot about it, and we're going to be seeing a lot of advocacy work in the area of criminal justice. I think what these votes show us is that just like across the country, complex people with complex views are using their votes on ballot measures to show where their personal opinions and views differ from those of the candidates they still choose to support. And that holds true even locally. Voters were saying no to increased sales taxes, but then voting for candidates in the county of San Diego and the city of San Diego that feel differently about it. But then 3 cities, Lemon Grove, San Marcos, and Escondido, who typically would not vote for candidates, they increased sales tax while voting for candidates that go against those views. Now, did every place follow that trend on every measure? No, but it's enough to make it very, very interesting. So, takeaways. I think there's 2 really big takeaways from just what we've seen from the results of the election and how people voted on candidates and ballot measures. And I think the very first takeaway really is that things are going to move very, very fast for the next 2 years. Paying attention, rapid response, flexibility is going to be the name of the game. Whether it's in terms of rapid response for funding, flexibility in funding, rapid response advocacy, increased tracking, now is the time to make sure you have those measures in place because executive orders will start on day 1. The second big takeaway is that people really are complex and they're motivated by numerous things that affect their personal lives. One person can hold numerous views at the same time, even if those views seem to conflict with each other. And people prioritize those viewpoints in different ways. And the same goes for organizations. The election has clearly shown we cannot look at people as Democrats or Republicans, as progressives or conservatives, or make assumptions that we may know how people feel about issue X because they feel a particular way about issue Y. Listening and understanding what matters to people is going to become increasingly important, as is messaging and meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be. There's going to be a lot over the next 2 years. It may slow down after midterms, it may not, we don't know. If I could give you one piece of advice to definitely take away is to pace yourselves, take care of yourselves, and remember that no person and no organization is capable of giving 150% to every single battle and every single piece of legislation and every single issue. So working together is going to be very, very important. Pitching in where you can with what you're best at, because none of us are going to be any good to anyone if we all burn out by February. So that is enough for me, and let's get to the good stuff, which is our panel. And if you have questions for me, go ahead and hold them till the end or throw them in the chat because we're collecting those as we go. And I am going to introduce our amazing panelists now, starting with Margarita Luna. She's the Interim Managing Director for the California Endowment. She has been with TC in a variety of capacities as a program associate in the Health Access Gold Team, program manager of the 10-year Building Healthy Communities initiative, Senior Program Manager in the South region, and has also been the chair of the Inland Empire Funders Alliance, and a whole bunch of other incredible positions, all dealing with social justice and all of the issues that we care about. And Luis Montero-Adams, Director of Engage San Diego, which is the local voter engagement table. He's been with them since 2022. And before that, he was the Advocacy and Civic Engagement Manager to the San Diego LGBT Community Center, and also spent about a decade at Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest working in education, health services, and advocacy roles. So I'm going to start the conversation with our panelists by popping a few questions at them and then letting them tell you some of their big takeaways from this election and what they're looking at for the next 2 years. And then we'll go into questions and answers from the audience. Sound good? All right. So I'm going to let both of you answer these questions, and we'll go ahead and start with Margarita. My first question is, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities you're thinking about moving into a new administration?
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. And I actually want to ask Luis if he wants to start first. I mean, to me, it really is important to hear from community first. And that's a value to center their voice. So actually, I want to invite you, Luis, if you would be willing.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Welcome the opportunity. Well, everyone, thank you so much. Again, Luis Montero-Adams, pronouns he, him. Rhiannon, will let you know from the very beginning that I look forward to that data call at some point in the future because I am a data nerd and do think that that would be fun. For Engage San Diego, I'll quickly say that if my organization is one that you are not too familiar with, that is perfectly fine. And in many ways, that is kind of how we operate. Engage San Diego is currently a coalition of 15 community-based organizations, and I'll be happy to share our website in the chat or maybe in some of the follow-up materials from this meeting. But my joke is that I don't like to make phone calls. I don't generally knock on doors of voters, but I coordinate the efforts of the 15 community-based organizations that are doing that amongst low propensity, LGBTQ, BIPOC, and low-income communities. These are community-based organizations that have built up their relationships with their communities, are seen as trusted messengers, and have come together to ensure that as broad of a coalition of underrepresented communities in San Diego have their voices heard. So when we're looking at the election results, really what we are hoping to do is try to understand how those communities that have often times been underrepresented, historically disenfranchised, are going to have their voices heard, but also their day-to-day lives impacted by the results of the election. Some of the very quick takeaways that we're looking at right now is that both in the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego, we've been able to retain a progressive majority. So that means that at the county of San Diego, 3 of the 5 elected officials identify as progressive leaders. And within the city of San Diego, all 9 of the city council members, as well as the mayor's office, really identify themselves and lead a lot of their work as trying to be part of that progressive voice for the region. What I do want to put into context with that point, though, is that we do have a number of power imbalances within the region, and kind of how that plays out will be important for some of my future answers. So I just want to lay some basic information. When I think of San Diego as a region, I really do think about San Diego as part of a 10-year process of how has our region been impacted since the last census in 2020 and how it's going to continue to change until the next census in 2030. If you Google San Diego's population, you'll see a number somewhere in the range of 3.2, 3.3 million residents. And although that is the true count from the census, it doesn't fully represent the region, because what we know is that in 2020, about 74% of San Diego households participated in the census. So almost 1 in 4 households did not participate, meaning that we don't have a true accurate count of the region. It might be closer to 4 million people. And what also is not represented there is how many people live across the border in Tijuana, in Mexico, Mexico, who are constantly accessing services within our region. So the number of people who are active within San Diego County is oftentimes far greater than what is captured in the census. The second thing I'll say to that is that there are immense sources of power within those two elected bodies that I just mentioned. At the city of San Diego, every year the city votes on a budget. This past year, it was just over $5 billion. That budget is representative of over 1.5 million residents within the city of San Diego, but it's decided upon by 10 human beings, the 9 council members and the mayor. At the county, it's even a worse ratio. The county's budget is over $8 billion that is decided upon by 5 human beings and impacts the day-to-day lives of, as I mentioned, 3, 4, maybe even 5 million individuals who access services within the county on a yearly basis. Within 15 human beings, we have over $13.5 billion that impact the lives of our communities on a day-to-day basis. So yes, we were able to retain a progressive power within those offices, but what power will those offices continue to have, and will they be able to receive as continued support both from the state and the federal government? When we look at local government, we generally think about two general buckets of power. One is the policy, and the second is the budgetary. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but in the city of San Diego, we are facing a deficit of somewhere in the range of $150 million to $200 million. The initial goal for balancing that budget was to pass one of the local ballot measures, ballot measure E, which would have provided up to $400 million in annual revenue. Not only would it have closed the projected budget gap for this upcoming year, but it also would have provided new sources of revenue for increasing and expanding the services that City of San Diego residents count on and need in order to lead successful lives. Without that measure passing, it has officially failed. We are now looking at budget cuts. So instead of expanding services, what services are going to retract? Similarly, when we look at policy, I think Rhiannon, you identified it perfectly, which is the idea of moving into a world of reactive policy. I think for a large number of community-based organizations for the last number of years, we've really been trying to expand services that are available to San Diegans. We've seen that at the county, at the city, really working together in a cohesive manner to make sure that San Diego is as best of a place for all of its residents, not just a select few. Unfortunately, these offices are now going to be moving into that reactive mode. Instead of having the ability to be proactive and pass new policy, we're scared that we're going to have to be replying to, budgetary changes from the state or federal government, new mandates coming down from administrations. And really what we're looking at is a system in which we are currently looking at a budget deficit that may be compounded and worsened by these next few years. So I do see this as a challenging moment for San Diego's communities. I don't think it is a moment where we are without hope, but it is a moment in which we do have to continue to work together to make sure that we are trying to pass as protective a policy as possible, but that we are able and ready and knowledgeable to be able to respond when those moments of need come up, because we know that they will. But because we've come together as communities in the past, we know that we can come together as strong communities in the future. I'll share a little bit more, but that's kind of where I'm starting off with some of my thoughts. Margarita, would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Luis. Um, yeah, I feel like the challenges and opportunities are sometimes one and the same. One of the things that we've been really reckoning with is that the the sort of the hate and vitriol in this divisive election has a real impact on our communities. And especially with San Diego and Imperial being border communities, really thinking about the impacts on our undocumented and immigrant communities is something that's really at the forefront. Now, many of us are thinking about how do we respond in this moment, and ensuring the safety and security of our communities is one of the biggest things that many of us are really thinking about, and especially when it comes to protecting our communities during this time. I think what's difficult is that many of us want to respond, and how do we not put all of our resources in a defensive strategy is something that we're really, really thinking about and holding, because building towards the vision that our communities have been striving for some time is something that we don't want to give up. And it's really easy to lose sight of in this environment when we really feel like we're on our heels. And so, really thinking about how do we develop a strategy, a grant making strategy in our case, that is balancing both a proactive strategy that's building towards the kind of community health and racial equity for us. And also, as Rhiannon was saying, staying flexible and making sure that we have the resources to pivot, to have a defensive strategy at the ready as well. And so that's what we're in the process of really developing, and also recognizing that no one funder can go at this alone. And so the challenge is coordinating among funders, as we all know, can be really difficult when we all have our own sights on a strategy that we want to move forward, while at the same time, the opportunity is the potential to actually coordinate resources, to coordinate a strategy, and to have a real impact in this time is something that I feel like is a real opportunity that we want to really lean into and continue to build upon. I think in times of crisis, folks tend to go into their corners and try to plan alone. And I really want to encourage folks to reach out, and to especially reach out to our community partners like Luis and others who really have their eyes and ears on the ground and understand the impacts of this election on the day-to-day lives of the communities that we have the privilege of serving. And so making sure that we're reaching out, making sure that we're coordinating as much as possible is something that is both going to be a challenge and an opportunity for us to really continue to build these bridges together.
Thank you both. Those were giving a lot to chew on. So sort of moving from there, we're kind of hearing about sort of reactive and defensive versus proactive. How do you think that is going to be changing? Like, how will you be working differently or the same in your respective areas? And I'm happy for either of you to hop in and start with that question.
I can jump in. So really one of the key areas that we're looking at is what does it look like for Engage San Diego to expand its reach? I started off by saying that it's possible you've never heard about me, and that's perfectly fine. And I'm working with 15 community-based organizations. But how do we expand that and make sure that we are talking to as many of the communities' voices within, San Diego? One of the things that I'm absolutely proud of is that Engage San Diego works with almost as broad of a coalition of community-based organizations as I've had the honor of working with in my long career within the region. But it also means that there are new spaces that we haven't had a chance to jump into. We haven't brought in new members in almost 5 years, which is a space that really has an opportunity to grow and expand. Right now, we're hoping to both shift our expansion both geographically and demographically. We are trying to work with younger organizations that are focused on youth engagement, such as Our Time to Act or ODA United. Youth Will. We're looking to reach out into, East County, which is a geographic portion of San Diego County that has historically been not engaged by Engage San Diego. We're creating new partnerships with Care San Diego, really trying to make sure that throughout San Diego County as a region, we have that opportunity to have the same conversations that have been rich and fulfilling in Central San Diego. But how do we make sure that we're not ourselves leaving those other voices behind? The other thing that I'll really highlight there is that when we look at San Diego County, this election season specifically has been one that, for me at least, felt historic and has been absolutely different than almost any other election that I've either volunteered with as a young child or been a voter in. For context, in March of this year, San Diego County had one of its lowest voter turnout rates for a presidential primary in decades. And I'm blinking on the exact number, I believe it was 36% of registered voters turned out in March, which was down relative to the two previous presidential primaries. In 2020 and 2016, we averaged about 50% of registered voters. That means that about a third of the voters that we were expecting to vote earlier this year stayed at home. We did an expansive listening series, and we talked to voters and tried to find out what it was that they felt, wasn't on the ballot, why they didn't feel the need. In context, there was also the historic flooding of San Diego at that time, just weeks before the election. For many people, it meant that there were other priorities within their lives that, had a bigger role that, elections may not always feel like the most pressing moment at that time. But on top of that, we also heard that their issues were not being focused on in their ballots. We had one proposition in March, which was Proposition 1. We felt that there was going to be a general shift in increase in voter participation for this November election. And right now, although the vote has not been certified, San Diego County is tracking towards a 76% voter turnout for the November election. In comparison, 2020 had an 83.5% voter turnout. 2016 had an 82% voter turnout. These are, above 80% voter turnouts that we had, as a region, become accustomed to. And now we are confronted by the fact that that 7% drop has drastically changed the narrative of who is voting, what they're voting for, and how their votes impact our realities. Rhiannon, as you mentioned earlier, votes tended to trend in the same political party direction, but those gaps narrowed. When we see a change of 1 or 2% of voter participation, those gaps change drastically. The fact that we saw almost a 7% drop from 2020 to this year's general presidential election has massive ramifications moving forward. Engage San Diego is really going to be doing a lot of work reaching out to those same voters and trying to find out, again, why they didn't come out to vote, what might have been different. Engage San Diego has been incredibly proud of expanding the opportunities for San Diegans to be able to vote. At this election, every single registered voter was mailed a ballot to their home. Every resident of San Diego could show up to any one of 50 different vote centers that were open 11 consecutive days ahead of the election, show up without any ID and vote provisionally, regardless of where they actually lived. We've expanded voter opportunities by creating vote centers in safe spaces, including the San Diego LGBT Community Center, meaning that anyone who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community or any other community can drive to Hillcrest, regardless of where they live, state their address, receive their localized ballot, and be able to vote in a place where they feel safe and empowered. San Diego has expanded its access to voting in such drastic ways, and yet we saw low voter turnout. So a large portion of our work is reaching out to a broader set of communities, working with them to engage and find out what we could have done differently, and making sure that as we continue to move forward, again, I'll talk more about the 2030 census in a few minutes, but it's my passion now. How do we make sure that these communities are ready for what is going to be one of the most fundamental moments of our region's history during the 2030 census? So, Margarita, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Luis. Balancing a proactive and a reactive strategy is something that we really were considering in advance of the election. So during the summer, we did a listening of our grantees to really understand what are they thinking about with respect to post-election scenario planning. And we knew that we needed to activate resources before we even knew the election results, just to prepare to really shore up the movement infrastructure of our partners on the ground. And so in listening to our partners, what came out of that was 3 areas of concern and interest for them as we really think about as sitting in as partners and really thinking about how do we shore up the infrastructure. So we have decided to move $10 million in resources in support of these 3 areas. One of them is around safety, security, and defense. We recognize that remains one of the main issues that folks are really considering, especially when we think about the divisiveness of the election. And it's safety, security, and defense in many, many ways. It's about financial security, it's about digital security, and it's also about physical security of our partners. It's also thinking about what are the ways that we need to be proactive in supporting our partners. So not just a defensive strategy, but really thinking about these are the things that they have needed for some time. And even thinking about how do they protect against mis and disinformation that often happens, that's really targeting their campaigns and the work that they're trying to move in communities, and even the ways that they're trying to shore up trust with government partners as well. So really thinking about how do we support them even with respect to narrative when it comes to safety, security, and defense. The other area was around healing and sustainability. We've been hearing this for some time from our partners, even before the pandemic, and definitely explicitly now that we're emerging from this pandemic that's still around, hanging around, is really recognizing that our partners are really suffering. It's really difficult for them to stay in a fight that is a long fight, and the sustainability of them to stay in places and in doing work that oftentimes is really about addressing the trauma in our communities, both personal, communal, and otherwise. And so, how do we support our partners to heal within the organizations, the folks that are doing the frontline work? How do they support culturally rooted healing in communities with the community members that they are working with every day? And then also, how do we make sure that they're sustaining themselves in this work? That's really, really critical. So that means considering folks who are employing, whether it's sabbatical programs or considering what are the ways that folks are employing flat structures, leadership structures that are really about shared leadership in communities, community organizations, so that no one person is shouldering the burden of the important work that they do from the day to day. And then the last area of investment is really around how can we learn about non-C3 vehicles. There's legislation right now that's moving HR 9495 that is really about the potential for nonprofits to have their C3 status revoked if they are considered supporting terrorist activity. And so the problem with legislation like this is that it could, they could single-handedly lose their C3 status. And so it's really important that we're thinking about what are the other ways that we can support our nonprofit partners to develop, whether it's C4 vehicles or LLC vehicles, what are the ways that they can continue to bring resources that continue to support their work in community. And so really considering the other ways that we can shore up the movement on the ground is something that we're really concerned about and really interested in doing. So that's kind of like the response that we're moving that for us was important regardless of the outcome of the election. And in each of our teams, we're also considering how do we continue to move a vision forward that our community partners have really been discussing with us over many, many years. That's really proactive vision of health and racial equity in California, while at the same time reserving some resources to really consider what is a defensive strategy to protect the gains that our partners have won over the years and continue to support them to do so.
Wonderful. And I saw Megan dropped in the chat a statement from the social sector on the HR 9495 that Margarita was just speaking about, which actually leads quite nicely into my next question for both of you, which is about specific policy change or issue areas that going into a new administration after this election are top of mind for you, whether that's something that you're specifically concerned about or potentially excited about. So kick it off, Luis, if you want to go ahead and grab that one.
Definitely. And I think this is the portion of the conversation where we get to the reactive is truly going to be dependent on what we see in the next few weeks, few months, few years. I think for this area, what I really wanted to highlight is just a couple of opportunities of possible policy that may come down from the federal government that then kind of trickles into the state and local offices. None of this is meant to say that this will happen or that we are planning for it to happen, but just being aware that within a key number of our communities, there are very real concerns for which we are starting to plan. Specifically within the LGBTQ community and reproductive rights communities, what we're looking at is a general trend of what does it look like for the federal government to impose new policy that may be restrictive, both on the services that are available, but also on the funding that is available. Two promises that we heard were that health and human services in general would likely change. We've already seen cabinet proposals. A campaign promise from the Trump administration was that there would be the elimination of the Department of Education. Within San Diego as a region, we have San Diego Unified School District, which is one of the largest school districts in the state and in the nation, that is currently facing a $176 million budget deficit moving into this year. How do the current budgetary concerns compound with possible changes from the federal government in an unexpected manner? And what does that mean for us as a region? How do we adapt? How do we change? One of the things that for us truly is interesting is what does it also look like? I believe, Margarita, you mentioned it for surveillance to increase. San Diego's in this really interesting moment where there are three kind of general movements that are starting to combine and coalesce into this moment. One of them, or three of them being homelessness services, a increase in mental health needs, as well as an increase or a change in the way that we're addressing substance abuse. And those are actually both policy priorities, but also priorities that have been put forward by Californian voters. As I mentioned, in March, we had Proposition 1, which passed, which was looked to be an opportunity to address mental health services and changes within the region. Just a few weeks ago, California overwhelmingly passed Proposition 36, which will have a direct impact on the way that we address substance abuse. Through all of that, homelessness is continuing to increase, and locally within our region, San Diego continues to see more individuals access homelessness services, support services for the first time than the number of individuals who are moving out of homelessness. Homelessness is increasing within our region and is being compounded by these other two issues. We have new policies in place that are looked at to possibly solve or address these issues, but it's too early to know how that's going to happen. Again, this is where those 15 human beings within our region, the council members, board of supervisors, and the mayor of San Diego, have immense power in how they're going to implement these policy moments and what that's going to look like for our region. I think one of the areas in there is tracking of license plates, surveillance. Within the city of San Diego, San Diego Police Department has increased its number of um, um, lights. Sorry, I'm blanking on the term. Streetlight surveillance systems. So we've had a new system of streetlight surveillance being placed into our communities that are tracking, movement. The police state that it helps them investigate when there are crimes, but it's also tracking who is where and at what time. This is a system that was purchased from an outside vendor. These are vendors that are working with cities, states, and federal agencies throughout the country. So although this is a service that San Diego is contracting to use locally, it's not a data system that is protected or held internally here within San Diego. We've already seen that this has been an issue when we have been looking at tracking of individuals who are coming into our region to access abortion care services, to access reproductive health services. And although the San Diego Police Department itself specifically is not planning to share any data with federal governments or federal agencies, we know that that is not data that is housed by them, and whether or not they can state that that information will never be used by other parties, I think would be really difficult for us to be able to state that permanently. Not only is there the access for other individuals outside of our region, but also just taking into consideration the human errors that happen with technology on any given moment. We're also seeing this technology more aggressively be used in specific spaces that have historically been private or protected. In Hillcrest, one of the nation's oldest and most recognized LGBTQ communities, we've actually seen an increase in surveillance cameras be placed within that neighborhood region. What does it look like for a pro-LGBTQ mayor to be able to place those cameras? Is drastically different than what a federal government might choose to do with those cameras within a target population that has already stated that it will be targeting and be focusing on its efforts on in the coming years. So again, that reactionary kind of combination of what does San Diego as a space proactively do to protect its residents, yet how do we create some kind of buffer system where an outside force doesn't force us to do anything that we are not hoping to do against our own residents. And last thing I'll kind of finish on is when we're looking at reproductive health within our region, one of the areas that we had talked a lot about is the Comstock laws that made it so that birth control, obscene items could not be passed through the mail. That becomes an interesting point within this time because so much of the medication that California uses as in regards to birth control, family planning, IVF services are oftentimes not created within the state. What would it mean in order for Californians to be able to access these same medical services that then have to be transported? We're seeing a lot of conversations from the Trump administration as to how older or antiquated laws that had not been considered for decades or centuries may come back into prevalence and be able to have an immediate impact on our day-to-day functions. So I think that there are some of those proactive policies where we might be able to, create new opportunities here within our region. We might be able to change the way in which our city and our county works. But I think we're also going to be in that moment of reacting to how does the federal administration state that they want to move forward with some of their priorities.
Thank you, Luis. You already talked about some of the things I was going to talk about, especially with the impacts of Prop 30s. No, it's great. I'm glad that you did. I think one of the things that I would add is really about the potential for mass deportation. We did see that actually happen in the last administration, and while we're here in California, the ways in which various sheriffs are cooperating with federal agencies to allow for that to happen in our communities varies depending on where you are in California. And so that is certainly something that is at the top of our minds with respect to just the diverse immigrant communities that we have across the state of California, and how do we continue to support those community-based organizations that are supporting those communities is something that is definitely at the top of our minds. I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is also the way that while once again we're here in California, we are impacted by the kinds of legislation that is passed at the federal level with respect to the way that we resource various programs that are social safety net programs here in California. One of the things that we've been also thinking about is Medicaid waivers, and the ability for us to really have some innovation in California has really been through the Medicaid waivers. And so being able to actually have ours renewed really will have an impact in the kinds of health services that we are able to provide to vulnerable communities throughout the state of California as well. So those are the kinds of things that we're watching. And also, um, that means that we're also doubling down in terms of the resources that we're providing to our advocate organizations, our organizing groups that are really uplifting the voices of community residents who have been the recipient of much of those services, but also the folks that are the most impacted when it comes to the ability of our communities to be able to provide them. So those are just other things that I would add to the list that Luis provided us.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And so as we wrap up, before we get to any questions that our attendees might have, I'd invite both of you to just sort of wrap things up with 2 or 3 minutes of anything that you haven't had a chance to say yet, biggest takeaways you want people to take from this, or just whatever it is you think is most important that you need to get off your chest. So go for it, Luis.
I feel like over the next few years, if you start seeing me in Zoom rooms, you're likely going to be like, oh, that's the census person. And that's where I'm going to end with this. So hopefully you'll join me and let me stand on my soapbox for just a few minutes. First, I just want to shout out really quickly to someone who I saw in the Zoom list earlier, but Michelle Silverthorne was an amazing resource to us during the 2020 census. Incredibly proud to have her here. And as we look at the 2030 census, there's a number of key things that are in play. As I mentioned earlier, California or San Diego County had an increased participation as high of 74.6, I believe, just under 75%. That means that 75% of households in San Diego County participated in the census, leaving 1 out of 4 houses out of that process. Across California, census participation was also in the low 70s. And because of that, our overall population count in California decreased relative to the 2010 census. California lost a congressional seat because of that. We actually not only did we lose a congressional seat, but we lost it to one of our sorry, I just saw Michelle's message, but we lost it to either Texas or Florida. And what we are looking at is that there's a possibility that the 2030 census, if California continues to underperform in its census numbers, could lose an additional anywhere between as little as 1 to 4 additional congressional seats. Those seats would then, of course, go to Texas and Florida, which are gaining in population. Not only do we lose political and representational power when we underperform in the census, but we also lose direct funding. Every year, the federal government allocates roughly $1.5 trillion in tax income to states to be able to provide services for its residents. This is directly proportional to the population of each state and then from each state to each region. We're looking at San Diego conceivably very likely losing one of its congressional seats, meaning that the region loses its political power, it loses funding that is core to continue to provide these services. And one of the things that I oftentimes think about is that for a long time, I was brought up with this idea that San Diego was a region that had a term that I had heard. I won't try to coin it, but brain drain, meaning that we were the space that was furthest geographically from its state capital and its federal capital. Of the continental U.S., we are furthest away from everything. We are also now facing a situation where we are noticing a power drain. For the last decade, San Diego has been powerfully represented both at the state and at the federal government. We had leaders like Tony Atkins, who represented us at both the state assembly and state senate. We have lost her leadership and her valuable voice. When the state of California is having its upcoming budgetary conversations, that powerful voice will no longer be in the room talking about the priorities and the needs of San Diegans. That's not to say that San Diego won't be treated fairly, but it means that we don't have that political power that we have counted upon for this past, if not many previous decades. So when we're looking at the kind of turning point of what could possibly change that, I truly am looking ahead 5 years into the future of how do we prepare for the 2030 census? How do we make sure that our communities are well aware of the vast impact that this one moment that happens every 10 years will have on our communities for the next decade? If we underperform, we will continue to lose political power. We will continue to lose vital funding. The budget gaps that I've mentioned are just a key few of them. San Diego is a beautifully diverse place with 18 different cities within the county. I'm only focusing on the city of San Diego because it is our largest city, but that doesn't mean that there aren't similar issues happening across the 17 other cities, that there aren't issues that are being faced by the unincorporated areas that are represented by the county board of supervisors. All of these dynamics, redistricting, access to resources will be decided in the 2030 census. We did a good job in the 2020 census, but that was based off of two factors. One, we had a governor who was able to step up early and declare that the census was a priority. But two, we also had the support from philanthropy that was able to say we have the space and capacity to fund the gaps and ensure that these communities are having their representation equally counted. We are stepping into a moment where Trump is taking control of the federal government in the critical portion of census preparation. We are going to lose Governor Newsom, who had championed the census. We don't know who will be the next governor during this upcoming census. We don't know what other political issues will be facing our residents. So, what do we do today in order to set ourselves up for success in the future? As I said earlier, one of the key areas that I'm really looking at is how do we make sure that Engage San Diego and other organizations like us expand our outreach today so that when we need to have those critical conversations in a few years, we are set up to really be able to talk to our community members and express the importance of the census. So this is my first of hopefully many soapbox rants about why the 2030 census is so important. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you over the next few years.
And I'm going to double down on what Luis is talking about. As the former chair of the Funders Alliance in the Inland Empire, the census was a really important, pivotal opportunity for funders to come together in a collaborative pooled fund. It actually drew the support of both counties, Riverside and San Bernardino, and became a super fund of sorts to really support the census during a critical time as the pandemic was taking root. And so it was really important that we are now thinking about how do we broaden the bench of partners who are engaged in census building from the network that we built at that time. And really considering that while folks may think 2030 is far off, it actually takes quite a bit to actually bring folks together so that it's a well-oiled engine and folks understand that they have a responsibility to really provide this role in their communities. Our trusted messengers are our nonprofits and helping them understand the ways that civic engagement, whether it's through census or really understanding how they could help the folks that they are in constant contact with, residents every day, on the right and the responsibility that they have to be engaged in their communities to really elevate their voices and to understand what's happening in their own communities. It's actually what builds the glue and the trust in government to actually show up to vote. And so this is not just about census. This is about a civic engagement muscle that can constantly be acted upon, not just when it comes to times to vote, but also to just really be able to elevate and address the real-time issues that happen in communities like, climate disasters that we are all familiar with. And so it's really important that we're thinking about how do we build, our everyday direct services nonprofits to be part of a power building ecosystem of other groups that are doing this on the daily. So consider, the broad bandwidth of the grantees that you have at your purview, and really consider what are the ways that you can help them think about really building their connections with the folks that they serve every day to be part of this as well.
Thank you both. So we do have a few questions that have been sent through the chat. So look to my document here. So here, and I will, either of you, welcome to answer any of these questions. So we have one that says, I am a small funder. What can I do that would make a difference? So either one of you want to jump on that one, feel free.
I'll give a very quick answer, and then Margarita, I think you might have a better answer. I think building off of what Margarita just said, which is, there are so many different support systems that are already in place, but the ones that we know are truly, at the core of it are the coalitions that are bringing together some of the core areas. So whether that is city, county funding, organizations like Engage San Diego, you can see all of the community-based organizations that are part of our coalition on our website, really supporting the organization that is most aligned with your work and in making sure that the infrastructure that we need is in place. I mentioned the infrastructure component because throughout this entire conversation, we've led with the idea we don't know what is coming down the pathway, but we know that something is and we need to be ready. If we don't have that infrastructure in place, then we won't be able to react in a timely manner.
There's so much that folks can do. As we all know, nonprofits are really wizards when it comes to dollars. They can make a dollar stretch. So don't count yourself out, I would say. And there are many ways to give. Luis outlined one that I think is really important, thinking about the backbone of alliances and coalitions that bring many folks together to be able to really have a larger voice with respect to the various issues that we care about. I think the other thing is to consider giving wellness grants to organizations that are really just trying to support the folks on their staff. Many nonprofits don't have just general operating dollars to be able to support staff in ways that are flexible, that are not necessarily about any programmatic work in particular. And so consider giving out general operating support grants, even if they're small grants, to organizations so that they can actually use those dollars in ways that actually meet the needs as they determine those. Having a slush fund of sorts for nonprofits is something that is really rare. And you could be that one funder that makes a difference.
Thank you both. That actually leads quite well into the next question, which was how are you supporting employees or volunteers at this time? Or do you have recommendations?
My answer is pretty quick, but which is I'm honored to be part of a couple of different coalitions, both on the statewide level here in California and nationally. Nationally, we work with State Voices, which is a coalition of tables from across each state in the United States. We are building up a kind of best practices. Margarita mentioned it earlier, whether it's sabbatical, extended weeks off at different points in the year. So a little bit more common is becoming the practice of allowing staff to take off the last 2 weeks in December, the first 2 weeks of July. What are the wraparound services that organizations can do to make sure that their staff are, feeling supported, but also empowered to do their work. So whether that's me working from home, whether that is, different kind of support systems. So we're still looking into this. We're still building it up because we know that for a lot of our staff and for our volunteers, organizers, a lot of us felt that this was going to be a moment where we were going to be able to take a little bit of a break. And with that, no longer feeling as if it is true, we want to make sure that everyone is as empowered and rejuvenated as possible to be able to continue this work.
Yeah, I think immediately internally for the endowment, we created spaces for folks to just come together and do some meaning making together about the results of the election. I think folks are holding a lot. It's the end of the year, which is typically when folks are feeling burnt out already. And so encouraging people to really let go of the ways that maybe their calendars are full of things that are maybe not priorities at this time, and making space to take care of themselves is important. We're also activating rapid response funds for healing and sustainability for nonprofits, recognizing that just as we are in, humans in a similar place, they are as well. And so being able to support them, to support their staff in ways that are meaningful to them, in ways that are culturally rooted. And so that's been important to us as well. And, just at the end of the day, just really recognizing that folks need each other during this time. And so creating spaces for folks to just recognize that they're not in this, they're not alone. And there are others who, first of all, are here to support them, but also are feeling very similarly. And so how do we just create those spaces to be together?
Thank you both again. I think we have time for one last question before we'll kick it over to Megan to close us out. This question, and some people, you've already mentioned a few of them, but so who are you working with so that you're not going it alone? I know, Luis, you mentioned State Voices and your community partners, but anyone else you want to throw on that list?
Yeah. Well, first, I also just want to say I realize that I didn't say this in the past answer, but I just really want to highlight as part of the leadership team, my goal was not to mandate what was going to help people feel better. So one of the big conversations for us has been reaching out to staff and asking them what would be the most beneficial for them, and really making sure that every member felt empowered. I did not want to say this will bring you joy. Please do this and feel joy, because I don't feel that that is the most accurate. One of the, so I mentioned State Voices at the federal level. Locally, I'm proud to be in a coalition with a number of other regional tables. So whether that is Inland Empire United, Lifting Up Contra Costa in Northern California, I am really proud to be part of a group of leaders within our regions who can lean on each other. The type of work that we do as regional tables is incredibly unique, and there are very few of us who have the experience or who have the knowledge to be able to kind of provide advice. So that is, the core group of individuals that I'm working with, and that's possible because of organizations like California Dinner Table, California Endowment, who have brought us together and who have kind of helped us identify that network of our peers. So if it wasn't for the support of our funders, if it wasn't for the support of my peers, I don't know that I would feel as comfortable moving into this future. But hopefully we're all able to find the support systems. And if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me directly.
Yeah, and I think for us, funders find our affinity spaces where we feel the most comfortable, where folks are speaking similar language, whether it's around an issue specific, um, you know, uh, group, or is it a larger philanthropic serving organization like Catalyst? And so I think it's important that you're really reaching out to the PSO that you feel most comfortable with, and asking about what are ways that you can coordinate with other funders to really talk about the issues that you care about, or the coordinate election response in ways that feel most aligned with your values and with the work that you're interested in supporting. But there's no shortage of spaces for funders to come together, even if it's just one-off conversations with those trusted colleagues that you've been building relationships with.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I really, really appreciate your time today, and this has been very insightful and eye-opening, and I think gives us a nice place to start this conversation and this work as we move into the new year. And obviously there will be many more conversations, hopefully also about data and the census, Luis. But this is a great place for us to start, I think. And that being said, I would like to hand it over to Megan to go ahead and just sort of close us out for the day. Megan, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to reiterate Rhiannon's gratitude to Luis and Margarita. We're happy to talk to you all of the time, but what's most useful is to have these conversations with folks who are doing the work out in our communities, fellow funders who are thinking through the same types of challenges and pivots and convictions that you have. So we just really appreciate the time and the perspective and being able to navigate the uncertainty that we're all in right now as we wonder what needs to change in the coming days, which would be the case no matter who had been elected to which positions and which policies were on the table, right? We're constantly adapting to our environment, and so being able to do that in a group of like-minded individuals is really wonderful. Uh, and with that in mind, as you all were speaking, I had this sort of like cognitive dissonance because I was thinking about this quote that I just put in the chat that everybody's heard at least between 1 and 7,000 times from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Um, and while that may be true, uh, what I think we're called on today, what I heard throughout this conversation was that this small group of committed residents, our calling is to empower the large group, right? The so-called masses. The notion of civic engagement and having your voice heard and being able to influence the policies that define the structures around our lives. That shouldn't be a privilege. That is an absolute right of everybody who resides in our region, our state, our country. And so as we're thinking about what needs to happen in the coming days, um, one takeaway I want to leave everybody with is that we've been talking a lot about policy and policy related uh, items, but none of this means that any individual on this call or in our philanthropic networks needs to be a policy expert, right? That is in many ways the whole the one of the main values of having this network of colleagues. Um, Philanthropy has the ability to show up with funding, but also think about how to be in relationship with your grantee partners and others, elected officials, whoever it might be in the community. So a handful of things that you might be able to do just when you sort of click the leave meeting button today. First thing is just check in with your grantees, right? Simplest thing that we maybe forget to do. It's like pick up your phone and call your mother, right? Like just call your grantees or send them an email or a WhatsApp and ask, how's it going? What are you thinking about? Is there anything that we could be doing together? And it's very possible that there's a lot you can do with funding that you've already allocated, right? It might not even need to be a new grant. You can just think differently about how to build flexibility into the dollars that are already out there. And of course, everybody would love to be supported by additional funding, in particular because that offers flexibility, right? We're talking about this environment in which we're all preparing to respond to whatever comes of the new federal, state, and local decision makers. And so having flexibility, being able to pivot is hugely advantageous. So if you're thinking about your 2025 budget or what you might do at the end of this year, offering grants that provide flexibility is a huge benefit that can be done. Secondly, is to think about the systems level work that undergirds the effectiveness of your direct service grant making, right? So if you're funding after school programs, remember that policies around youth and education and even community safety are really informing how those after school programs can take place. And again, you don't have to know where to go. You can ask Luis or Margarita or come to Catalyst and we will connect you with the folks who are doing that work so you can learn. That conversation doesn't have to be a commitment to funding, but the ability to learn about the context that you're grant making in is a great step. And the other thing I would say is remember that these policies are also going to impact philanthropy, right? We've talked a lot about what's going to happen in communities, but one of the major takeaways from the elections this year was that people's primary concern was the economy. People are really thinking about how do they take care of their families, right? Like what job opportunities do they have? What's their paycheck look like? How are they going to move forward? at a larger basis, that's going to be likely to impact tax policy. We know is a big campaign promise at the federal level, so we'll see changes in tax policy. And this bill that Margarita was referring to, you know, most of the foundations are 501(c)(3) organizations, right? So the ability to revoke that status applies not just to the, food bank, but also to our organizations. So being informed about what's going on in the economy, how that affects perhaps in increased dollars, the funding available to support community, but also what outcomes of things like HB 9495 and in the past, the Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action and the Fearless Fund settlement, all of these things, again, you don't have to know it, but showing up to sessions like this will help you stay on top of the context that you're operating in. So I just want to leave you with this notion of a community of support, right? Catalyst is here to support you, and there are lots of other places to go to be, as Margarita said, with folks who are speaking your language. If you want to know which organizations to connect with, we can help you do that. If you want to connect on a particular issue area, there are national and statewide tables around, for example, immigration. And if you noticed in the chat, Marisa Quiros, who's the CEO at the International Community Foundation, is a wealth of knowledge on how the civil society organizations in Mexico are connecting with the nonprofits in the United States, because as we know, our people, our environment, our culture are moving back and forth the whole time. And it's really important we think about that whole ecosystem. And then you can join one of our funder collaboratives where we're talking about immigration, climate, early childhood. And soon, I don't think I've said this publicly yet, but we'll have a youth-focused group that you can join if that's your thing, just to find the folks in our region who care about the same issues. So the last thing I'll leave you with is to remember we will have in March of 2025 with our partners in Philanthropy California, 100 days briefing to sort of take a look at what has transpired. As we're anticipating now, we'll have a little bit more concrete information. So that'll be online. Please join us for that. And then on December 11th is our winter social. So come on out, have some food and beverage with us, and just connect as humans, because we come back to this idea that at the end of the day, we're all people. The people we support are all people, and even the people we don't agree with are human beings who we want to hold with compassion and care, because the work of philanthropy is to support and love humanity. And it's just a privilege to be in a space with all of you as we figure out all the ways we can do that through thick and thin as the world changes around us. So again, thank you, Rhiannon, Margarita, Luis. And thank you to Marianne, who organized this all for us. Appreciate you. Please be in touch and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.